Hello, this is Chap Petersen, and welcome back to the Virginia Attorney. Welcome back. Today we're here to talk about a book that I wrote 2 years ago called Rebel. It had to do with my time in the Virginia State Senate. I was elected as a Democrat to the Virginia State Senate in 2007. Prior to that, I had been elected to the state legislature in 2001 as a Democrat in the House. At the time I was elected, Virginia was a heavily Republican state. In fact, when I was elected to the House in 2001, I was one of only 34 Democrats out of 100 members. I was the first person elected as a Democrat in 30 years in the seat that I occupied in Fairfax County. And so in a lot of ways, I was a novelty. I was young. I came into office. I had a lot of ideas, a lot of energy. I had knocked off a well-known Republican incumbent, and was really focused on serving my constituents in a district that had voted for George W. Bush for president, and wanted to make sure that I was consistent with that while still being true to my democratic values. I served 2 terms in the House and then was elected to the Senate in 2007. I served 16 years in the Senate. Again, when I was elected to the Senate, I defeated a Republican incumbent. It was a very closely watched race. I knocked on literally thousands and thousands of doors in order to win that race. And once I was elected, I really wanted to focus on, in this case, bringing forward a lot of goals that I had for Virginia, particularly on the economic, land use, environment, things that I wanted to do to move Virginia into the 21st century. And in a lot of ways, it was successful. I prided myself on someone that was, for lack of a better term, a rebel. I took on a lot of the corporate interests in Virginia. Some of my biggest issues were campaign finance reform, trying to limit donations made by the largest corporations. One of the biggest issues I had was taking on Dominion Power. That was our power utility in Virginia. They had a complete monopoly and were able to charge whatever prices they wanted for electricity. I fought back against that monopoly. I fought against price increases that they wanted to add. I tried to require a renewable portfolio for their environmental standards. I did all of that. I also had a very high-profile campaign to try and ban them from making political donations to Virginia politicians because they were literally buying the legislation that was passing on their behalf. So that was really most of my 16 years in the Senate. I was very proud of my service. Again, in some ways, I was a maverick. I was a Democrat. For the most time, I was in the minority. That changed in 2019. At that time, Governor Ralph Northam was elected, and Democrats took the majority both in the Senate and in the House. And in my case, I was entering my 4th term. I was in my early 50s at that point, and I was put on the Finance Committee. I was one of the senior Democrats. I had a chance to control the state budget, move forward with salary increases for state employees, for teachers, for college professors, all of which I advocated for and all of which I was able to accomplish. In a lot of ways, I was part of a leadership team that did a lot to move Virginia forward. I didn't agree with the Democrats on every issue. I voted against some of the gun control bills that I thought went too far in taking away people's rights. I definitely voted against bills that, in my opinion, had a negative impact on small business. I represented a district that had a large number of small businesses, mostly which were immigrant owned, first generation American owned. And I wanted to make sure that they were protected. But by and large, I was proud to be part of a Democratic team that was successful in Virginia. That all really changed in March of 2020 when COVID-19 happened. And at that time, the state was shut down by executive order of Governor Ralph Northam. And like most people, I didn't know what was going on. I'm not a medical doctor. And I saw what was happening nationally. I saw what was happening internationally. And for the first few weeks, I went along with it, even though my own 4 children were being locked out of school and were not getting their education. And then at some point, I was hearing from my own clients that were facing financial hardship, in some cases bankruptcy, because they couldn't reopen their businesses. I wrote letters to the governor, and when I didn't get a satisfactory answer, I eventually filed a lawsuit in June of 2020 to reopen the state. And since I was a Democrat in the legislature, I was filing a lawsuit. It got a lot of attention, got me a lot of hatred. But I felt it was the right thing to do. I felt it was unconstitutional for the governor to shut down a state for 3 months, particularly when the legislature itself was in session and could vote on all of these quote-unquote emergency laws that were being passed. So I felt like that was unconstitutional, and I advocated for that in my lawsuit. Shortly thereafter, the governor lifted many of those restrictions, and my lawsuit was eventually dismissed, not because it didn't have merit, because it was moot. It was no longer applicable. According to the Supreme Court, I didn't agree with them. But the schools remain closed, and they remained closed through the fall of 2020, and there was no plan to reopen the schools. And that to me was devastating for children. I saw the impact on my own children, both my oldest daughter who was in college, my second daughter who had graduated from high school by driving through a parking lot and being handed a diploma through an open window, through my son who was a freshman in high school that lost an entire year, who was not allowed to play sports, was basically shut down and forced to sit in front of a computer as a 15-year-old boy. And then my youngest daughter who was in special education, who had special needs, who was just at that time beginning to form her own friendships at school. And it was not right. And so in December 2020, I made a pledge that we were going to reopen the schools, and if we didn't, I was going to shut down the state budget, and nobody was going to get paid until the kids were back in the classroom. And I announced that in a Democratic caucus meeting. I think it shocked a lot of people, but I was able to put together an alliance of another, what I will call maverick Democrat named Joe Morrissey from Richmond, and then was able to talk to a very courageous Republican named Siobhan Donovan, who got the Republican caucus on board. And the message was clear. We're either going to reopen schools and get these kids back in the classroom and away from this remote learning, or else we're just not going to have a state budget and no one's going to get paid. Not the legislature, not the governor, nobody. And I said I'm going to hold to that threat. I don't care if I never get elected to anything, I don't care. But those kids need to be back in class. We eventually passed legislation in February of 2021, which reopened the schools. It was hotly debated. It passed on a vote of 26-13. It was eventually signed by the governor. As a direct result of that legislation, which I advocated very strongly for, the schools reopened on March 1st in 2021. As a result, schools really all over the East Coast reopened as a result of the action we took in the Virginia Senate. And so that had national significance, and I was very proud of that. I thought as a result of that struggle, which was successful, that the COVID-19 scare, the hysteria, all the restrictions, the lockdowns would go away. I was wrong. In a lot of ways, they came back and were as strict and as rigorous as ever. My kids went back to school, but unfortunately when they went back to school, they had to wear masks over their face. They were not allowed to have extracurricular activities. They were treated like inmates in a detention facility, all of which was based on allegedly science. I asked repeatedly for the scientific studies that would justify these types of restrictive measures on kids, even while I saw adults walking around in public without a mask on, just acting normal. Nobody came forward with any studies. Instead, we were told that this was how it had to be if schools were going to remain open. So in the fall of 2021, I had already publicly announced I thought the mask mandate was ridiculous. I did not think it was constitutional. I didn't think the governor had the power to enforce that on school districts, which are independent districts under the Virginia Constitution. And so when Governor Glenn Youngkin was elected in November, I talked to him and said, we need to get rid of this. I had told my own children, I want you to go back to normal. I told my son, you're going to have a normal senior year. He had had 2 years of restrictions and lockdowns. And so when the governor came into office, the new governor, myself and Senator Donovan again combined on legislation, which passed in mid-February of 2022, which ended the mask mandate in Virginia. Basically said every student or every parent had a right to decide whether or not their child would wear a mask in class, and they would not be subject to any penalty as a result of that decision. That law took effect March 1, 2022. It had a national impact. Prior to that law taking effect, you probably had 24 states, all of which were blue states, California, New York, Maryland, Virginia, which still had mask mandates on kids going to schools. After that, those mask mandates went away literally in a matter of weeks. Once Virginia passed the new law, yes, kids got COVID, and you know what? They got well almost immediately thereafter. At that point, I think the COVID-19 pandemic officially ended because the fear ended, because people realized that children as well as able-bodied adults were not at risk. They were going to be fine. And once that they took the masks off and started acting normal again, we were able to go back to normal as a society. And at the time, that was a minority opinion that I had. I think now people look back and realize, yeah, that's really what happened. The pandemic, outside of the first few weeks, was really a lot more about fear than it was about science. And once we got past the fear and conquered that, kids were able to go back to normal. The death rate started to go back down. Our mortality rates went back to normal, and people started getting the health care and the exercise and the exposure that they needed really to get back to being healthy. So all these opinions did not make me popular with the Democrats. I was primaried in the spring of 2023. All the stands that I had taken were basically put forward as saying I was a Republican or I was a conservative or I didn't follow the party line, and I ended up losing my seat. And that was hard because I had worked very hard on behalf of the Democratic Party in Virginia, and a lot of my heroes dating back to John Kennedy have been Democrats. People like Mark Warner and Tim Kaine have been good friends of mine, and to lose that support and lose that nomination was difficult. It was one of the things that motivated me to write the book. And here it is, book. It says Rebel by Chap Petersen, the story of a Democratic state senator who fought against the COVID-19 shutdowns. So I was glad to publish that book. We came out with it in, I believe it was April of 2024, so approximately a year and a half ago. And one of the aspects of the book that I was most proud of was the connection that I had formed with the Korean American population in Virginia, as well as in Korea. My wife is Korean American. She was born in South Korea. And that was an important part of my representation, making sure that minority group, which was a large minority group in Fairfax County, was represented. One of my proudest accomplishments, which I did alongside Dr. Hyun Lee, who was my advisor when I was a state senator, was opening a campus at George Mason University in Incheon, South Korea. And had a chance to visit that campus. It's become a very successful branch campus for George Mason University, which is a Virginia public university, and has over 1,000 students. And so one of the things we're doing this summer, which is to say summer of 2025, is coming out with a Korean language of Rebel, which is right here, which is pronounced Johongcha. I think I have that correct. Dr. Lee can correct me. But the bottom line is, I'm proud of the service that I had in the Virginia State Senate. I'm proud of my role in ending the COVID-19 restrictions and allowing children to get back to normal and allowing the United States to get back to normal. And I talk about that in the book, the effect that Virginia had, our leadership, in really bringing the U.S. back to normal and ending the fear of the pandemic. And proud of that, and then proud that we've been able to publish that in Korean and talk about the accomplishments we had in really furthering the U.S.-Korean relationship. So thank you if you listened all the way through. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. And again, this is Chap Petersen on behalf of the Virginia Attorney. Thank you.